Awakened to life out of the night of unconsciousness, the will finds itself an individual, in an endless and boundless world, among innumerable individuals, all striving, suffering, erring; and as if through a troubled dream it hurries back to its old unconsciousness. Yet till then its desires are limitless, its claims inexhaustible, and every satisfied desire gives rise to a new one. No possible satisfaction in the world could suffice to still its longings, set a goal to its infinite cravings, and fill the bottomless abyss of its heart. Then let one consider what as a rule are the satisfactions of any kind that a man obtains. For the most part, nothing more than the bare maintenance of this existence itself, extorted day by day with unceasing trouble and constant care in the conflict with want, and with death in prospect. Everything in life shows that earthly happiness is destined to be frustrated or recognized as an illusion. The grounds of this lie deep in the nature of things. Accordingly, the life of most men is troubled and short. Those who are comparatively happy are so for the most part only apparently, or else, like men of long life, they are the rare exceptions, a possibility of which there had to be, as decoy birds. Life presents itself as a continual deception in small things as in great. If it has promised, it does not keep its word, unless to show how little worth desiring were the things desired. Thus we are deluded now by hope, now by what was hoped for. If it has given, it did so in order to take. The enchantment of distance shows us paradises which vanish like optical illusions when we have allowed ourselves to be mocked by them. Happiness accordingly always lies in the future, or else in the past, and the present may be compared to a small dark cloud which the wind drives over the sunny plain. Before and behind it all is bright, only it itself always casts a shadow. The present is therefore always insufficient, but the future is uncertain, and the past irrevocable. Life, with its hourly, daily, weekly, yearly, little, greater, and great misfortunes, with its deluded hopes and its accidents destroying all our calculations, bears so distinctly the impression of something with which we must become disgusted, that it is hard to conceive how one has been able to mistake this and allow oneself to be persuaded that life is there in order to be thankfully enjoyed, and that man exists in order to be happy. Rather, that continual illusion and disillusion, and also the nature of life throughout, presents itself to us as intended and calculated to awaken the conviction that nothing at all is worth our striving, our efforts and struggles, that all good things are vanity, the world and all its ends bankrupt, and life a business which does not cover its expenses, so that our will may turn away from it. The way in which this vanity of all objects of the will makes itself known and comprehensible to the intellect, which is rooted in the individual, is primarily time. It is the form by means of which that vanity of things appears as their perishableness. For on account of this, all our pleasures and joys disappear in our hands, and we afterwards ask astonished where they have remained. That nothingness itself is therefore the only objective element in time, that is, that which corresponds to it in the inner nature of things, thus that of which it is the expression. Just on this account time is the a priori necessary form of all our perceptions. In it everything must present itself, even we ourselves. Accordingly, first of all, our life is like a payment which one receives in nothing but copper pence, and yet must then give a discharge for. The copper pence are the days, the discharge is death. For at last time makes known the judgment of nature concerning the work of all the beings which appear in it, in that it destroys them. "And rightly so, for all that arises is worthy only of being destroyed. Hence were it better that nothing arose." Thus old age and death, to which every life necessarily hurries on, are the sentence of condemnation on the will to live, coming from the hands of nature itself, and which declares that this will is an effort which frustrates itself. "What thou hast wished," it says, "ends thus: desire something better." Hence the instruction which his life affords to every one consists as a whole in this, that the objects of his desires continually delude, waver, and fall, and accordingly bring more misery than joy, till at last the whole foundation upon which they all stand gives way, and that his life itself is destroyed, and so he receives the last proof that all his striving and wishing was a perversity, a false path. Then old age and experience hand in hand lead him to death, and make him understand, after a search so painful and so long, that all his life he has been in the wrong. We shall, however, enter into the details of the matter, for it is in these views that I have met with most contradiction. First of all, I have to confirm by the following remarks the proof given in the text of the negative nature of all satisfaction, thus of all pleasure and all happiness, in opposition to the positive nature of pain. We feel pain, but not painlessness. We feel care, but not the absence of care. Fear, but not security. We feel the wish as we feel hunger and thirst, but as soon as it has been fulfilled, it is like the mouthful that has been taken, which ceases to exist for our feeling the moment it is swallowed. Pleasures and joys we miss painfully whenever they are wanting, but pains, even when they cease after having long been present, are not directly missed, but at the most are intentionally thought of by means of reflection. For only pain and want can be felt positively, and therefore announce themselves. Well-being, on the other hand, is merely negative. Therefore we do not become conscious of the three greatest blessings of life, health, youth, and freedom, so long as we possess them, but only after we have lost them, for they also are negations. We only observe that days of our life were happy after they have given place to unhappy ones. In proportion as pleasures increase, the susceptibility for them decreases. What is customary is no longer felt as a pleasure. Just in this way, however, is the susceptibility for suffering increased, for the loss of what we are accustomed to is painfully felt. Thus the measure of what is necessary increases through possession, and thereby the capacity for feeling pain. The hours pass the quicker, the more agreeably they are spent, and the slower, the more painfully they are spent, because pain, not pleasure, is the positive, the presence of which makes itself felt. In the same way, we become conscious of time when we are bored, not when we are diverted. Both these cases prove that our existence is most happy when we perceive it least, from which it follows that it would be better not to have it. Great and lively joy can only be conceived as the consequence of great misery, which has preceded it, for nothing can be added to a state of permanent satisfaction but some amusement, or the satisfaction of vanity. Hence, all poets are obliged to bring their heroes into anxious and painful situations, so that they may be able to free them from them. Dramas and epics, accordingly, always describe only fighting, suffering, tormented men, and every romance is a raree-show in which we observe the spasms and convulsions of the agonized human heart. Walter Scott has naively expressed this aesthetic necessity in the conclusion to his novel Old Mortality. Before so confidently affirming that life is a blessing worth desiring or giving thanks for, let one compare calmly the sum of the possible pleasures which a man can enjoy in his life with the sum of the possible sorrows which may come to him in his life. I believe the balance will not be hard to strike. At bottom, however, it is quite superfluous to dispute whether there is more good or evil in the world, for the mere existence of evil decides the matter. For the evil can never be annulled, and consequently can never be balanced by the good which may exist along with it or after it. 1,000 pleasures are not worth one torment. For that 1,000 had lived in happiness and pleasure would never do away with the anguish and death agony of a single one. And just as little does my present well-being undo my past suffering. If, therefore, the evils in the world were 100 times less than is the case, yet their mere existence would be sufficient to establish a truth which may be expressed in different ways. though always somewhat indirectly, the truth that we have not to rejoice, but rather to mourn at the existence of the world, that its non‐existence would be preferable to its existence, that it is something which at bottom ought not to be, &c., &c. Very beautiful is Byron's expression of this truth. Our life is a false nature, 'tis not in the harmony of things this hard decree, this uneradicable taint of sin, this boundless upas, this all‐blasting tree, whose root is earth, whose leaves and branches be the skies, which rain their plagues on men like dew, disease, death, bondage, all the woes we see, and worse, the woes we see not, which throb through the immedicable soul with heartaches ever new. End quote. If the world and life were an end in themselves, and accordingly required theoretically no justification, and practically no indemnification or compensation, but existed, for instance, as Spinoza and the Spinozists of the present day represent it, as the single manifestation of a God, who, anima causa, or else in order to mirror himself, undertook such an evolution of himself, and hence its existence neither required to be justified by reasons, nor redeemed by results, then the sufferings and miseries of life would not indeed have to be fully equalled by the pleasures and well‐being in it. For this, as has been said, is impossible, because my present pain is never abolished by future joys, for the latter fill their time as the former fills its time. But there would have to be absolutely no suffering, and death also would either have not to be, or else to have no terrors for us. Only thus would life pay for itself. But since now our state is rather something which had better not be, everything about us bears the trace of this, just as in hell everything smells of sulphur. For everything is always imperfect and illusory, everything agreeable is displaced by something disagreeable, every enjoyment is only a half one, every pleasure introduces its own disturbance, every relief new difficulties, every aid of our daily and hourly need leaves us each moment in the lurch and denies its service. The step upon which we place our foot so often gives way under us, nay, misfortunes great and small are the element of our life. And, in a word, we are like Phineus, whose food was all tainted and made uneatable by the Harpies. 2 remedies for this are tried. First, eulabeia, that is, prudence, foresight, cunning. It does not fully instruct us, is insufficient, and leads to defeat. Secondly, the stoical equanimity, which seeks to arm us against all misfortunes by preparedness for everything and contempt of all. Practically, it becomes cynical renunciation, which prefers once for all to reject all means of relief and all alleviations. It reduces us to the position of dogs, like Diogenes in his tub. The truth is, we ought to be wretched, and we are so. The chief source of the serious evils which affect men is man himself. Homo homini lupus. Whoever keeps this last fact clearly in view beholds the world as a hell, which surpasses that of Dante in this respect, that one man must be the devil of another. For this, one is certainly more fitted than another, an arch-fiend indeed, more fitted than all others, appearing in the form of a conqueror, who places several 100,000 men opposite each other and says to them, "To suffer and die is your destiny, now shoot each other with guns and cannons," and they do so. In general, however, the conduct of men towards each other is characterized as a rule by injustice, extreme unfairness, hardness, nay, cruelty. An opposite course of conduct appears only as an exception. Upon this depends the necessity of the state and legislation, and upon none of your false pretenses. But in all cases which do not lie within the reach of the law, that regardlessness of his like, peculiar to man, shows itself at once. A regardlessness which springs from his boundless egoism, and sometimes also from wickedness. How man deals with man is shown, for example, by negro slavery, the final end of which is sugar and coffee. But we do not need to go so far. At the age of 5 years to enter a cotton spinning or other factory, and from that time forth to sit there daily, first 10, then 12, and ultimately 14 hours, performing the same mechanical labour, is to purchase dearly the satisfaction of drawing breath. But this is the fate of millions, and that of millions more is analogous to it. We others, however, can be made perfectly miserable by trifling misfortunes, perfectly happy not by the world. Whatever one may say, the happiest moment of the happy man is the moment of his falling asleep, and the unhappiest moment of the unhappy that of his awaking. An indirect but certain proof of the fact that men feel themselves unhappy, and consequently are so, is also abundantly afforded by the fearful envy which dwells in us all, and which in all relations of life, on the occasion of any superiority, of whatever kind it may be, is excited, and cannot contain its poison. Because they feel themselves unhappy, men cannot endure the sight of one whom they imagine happy. He who for the moment feels himself happy would like to make all around him happy also, and says, "Que tout le monde ici soit heureux de ma joie." If life were in itself a blessing to be prized and decidedly to be preferred to non-existence, the exit from it would not need to be guarded by such fearful sentinels as death and its terrors. But who would continue in life as it is if death were less terrible? And again, who could even endure the thought of death if life were a pleasure? But thus the former has still always this good, that it is the end of life. And we console ourselves with regard to the suffering of life with death, and with regard to death with the suffering of life. The truth is that the two inseparably belong to each other, for together they constitute a deviation from the right path, to return to which is as difficult as it is desirable. If the world were not something which, expressed practically, ought not to be, it would also not be theoretically a problem. But its existence would either require no explanation, inasmuch as it would be so entirely self-evident that wonder concerning it or a question about it could arise in no mind, or its end would present itself unmistakably. Instead of this, however, it is indeed an insoluble problem, for even the most perfect philosophy will yet always contain an unexplained element, like an insoluble deposit, or the remainder which the irrational relation of two quantities always leaves over. Therefore, if one ventures to raise the question why there is not rather nothing than this world, the world cannot be justified from itself, no ground, no final cause of its existence can be found in itself, it cannot be shown that it exists for its own sake, that is, for its own advantage. In accordance with my teaching, this can certainly be explained from the fact that the principle of its existence is expressly one which is without ground, a blind will to live, which as thing in itself cannot be made subject to the principle of sufficient reason, which is merely the form of the phenomenon, and through which alone every why is justified. But this also agrees with the nature of the world, for only a blind will, no seeing will, could place itself in the position in which we behold ourselves. A seeing will would rather have soon made the calculation that the business did not cover the cost, for such a mighty effort and struggle with the straining of all the powers, under constant care, anxiety, and want, and with the inevitable destruction of every individual life, finds no compensation in the ephemeral existence itself, which is so obtained, and which passes into nothing in our hands. Hence, then, the explanation of the world from the Anaxagorean nous, that is, from a will accompanied by knowledge, necessarily demands optimism to excuse it, which accordingly is set up and maintained in spite of the loudly crying evidence of a whole world full of misery. Life is there given out to be a gift, while it is evident that every one would have declined such a gift if he could have seen it and tested it beforehand. Just as Lessing admired the understanding of his son, who, because he had absolutely declined to enter life, had to be forcibly brought into it with the forceps, but was scarcely there when he hurried away from it again. On the other hand, it is then well said that life should be, from one end to the other, only a lesson, to which, however, any one might reply, for this very reason I wish I had been left in the peace of the all-sufficient nothing, where I would have had no need of lessons or of anything else. If indeed it should now be added that he must one day give an account of every hour of his life, he would be more justified in himself demanding an account of why he had been transferred from that rest into such a questionable, dark, anxious, and painful situation. To this then we are led by false views. For human existence, far from bearing the character of a gift, has entirely the character of a debt that has been contracted. The calling in of this debt appears in the form of the pressing wants, tormenting desires, and endless misery established through this existence. As a rule, the whole lifetime is devoted to the paying off of this debt. But this only meets the interest. The payment of the capital takes place through death. And when was this debt contracted? At the begetting. Accordingly, if we regard man as a being whose existence is a punishment and an expiation, we then view him in a right light. The myth of the fall, although probably like the whole of Judaism borrowed from the Zend Avesta, Bundahish 15, is the only point in the Old Testament to which I can ascribe metaphysical, although only allegorical truth. Indeed, it is this alone that reconciles me to the Old Testament. Our existence resembles nothing so much as the consequence of a false step and a guilty desire. New Testament Christianity, the ethical spirit of which is that of Brahmanism and Buddhism, and is therefore very foreign to the otherwise optimistic spirit of the Old Testament, has also very wisely linked itself on precisely to that myth. Indeed, without this it would have found no point of connection with Judaism at all. If any one desires to measure the degree of guilt with which our existence is tainted, then let him look at the suffering that is connected with it. Every great pain, whether bodily or mental, declares what we deserve, for it could not come to us if we did not deserve it. That Christianity also regards our existence in this light is shown by a passage in Luther's commentary on Galatians, chapter 3, which I only have beside me in Latin. An outcry has been made about the melancholy and disconsolate nature of my philosophy. Yet it lies merely in the fact that instead of inventing a future hell as the equivalent of sin, I show that where guilt lies in the world there is already something akin to hell. But whoever is inclined to deny this can easily experience it. And to this world, to this scene of tormented and agonized beings, who only continue to exist by devouring each other, in which therefore every ravenous beast is the living grave of thousands of others, and its self-maintenance is a chain of painful deaths, and in which the capacity for feeling pain increases with knowledge, and therefore reaches its highest degree in man, a degree which is the higher the more intelligent the man is. To this world it has been sought to apply the system of optimism, and demonstrate to us that it is the best of all possible worlds. The absurdity is glaring. But an optimist bids me open my eyes and look at the world, how beautiful it is in the sunshine, with its mountains and valleys, streams, plants, animals, etc., etc. Is the world then a raree show? These things are certainly beautiful to look at, but to be them is something quite different. Then comes a teleologist, and praises to me the wise arrangement by virtue of which it is taken care that the planets do not run their heads together, that land and sea do not get mixed into a pulp, but are held so beautifully apart, also that everything is neither rigid with continual frost nor roasted with heat. In the same way, that in consequence of the obliquity of the ecliptic, there is no eternal spring, in which nothing could attain to ripeness, etc., etc. But this, and all like it, are mere conditiones sine quibus non. If in general there is to be a world at all, if its planets are to exist at least as long as the light of a distant fixed star requires to reach them, and are not like Lessing's sun to depart again immediately after birth, then certainly it must not be so clumsily constructed that its very framework threatens to fall to pieces. But if one goes on to the results of this applauded work, considers the players who act upon the stage which is so durably constructed, and now sees how with sensibility pain appears, and increases in proportion as the sensibility develops to intelligence, and then how, keeping pace with this, desire and suffering come out ever more strongly, and increase till at last human life affords no other material than this for tragedies and comedies, then whoever is honest will scarcely be disposed to set up hallelujahs. David Hume, in his Natural History of Religion, sections 6, 7, 8, and 13, has also exposed, mercilessly but with convincing truth, the real though concealed source of these last. He also explains clearly in the 10th and 11th books of his Dialogues on Natural Religion, with very pertinent arguments, which are yet of quite a different kind from mine, the miserable nature of this world and the untenableness of all optimism, in doing which he attacks this in its origin. Both works of Hume's are as well worth reading as they are unknown at the present day in Germany, where, on the other hand, incredible pleasure is found patriotically in the most disgusting nonsense of home‐bred, boastful mediocrities, who are proclaimed great men. Hamann, however, translated these dialogues. Kant went through the translation, and late in life wished to induce Hamann's son to publish them, because the translation of Platner did not satisfy him. See Kant's biography by F. W. Schubert, pages 81 and 165. From every page of David Hume there is more to be learned than from the collected philosophical works of Hegel, Herbart, and Schleiermacher together. The founder of systematic optimism, again, is Leibniz, whose philosophical merit I have no intention of denying, although I have never succeeded in thinking myself into the monadology, pre-established harmony, and identitas indiscernibilium. His Nouveaux Essais sur l'Entendement are, however, merely an excerpt, with a full yet weak criticism, with a view to correction of Locke's work, which is justly of world-wide reputation. He here opposes Locke with just as little success as he opposes Newton in the Tentamen de motuum coelestium causis, directed against the system of gravitation. The Critique of Pure Reason is specially directed against this Leibniz-Wolfian philosophy, and has a polemical, nay, a destructive relation to it, just as it is related to Locke and Hume as a continuation and further construction. That at the present day the professors of philosophy are on all sides engaged in setting Leibniz, with his juggling, upon his legs again, nay, in glorifying him, and, on the other hand, in depreciating and setting aside Kant as much as possible, has its sufficient reason in the Primum Vivere. The Critique of Pure Reason does not admit of one giving out Judaistic mythology as philosophy, nor of one speaking without ceremony of the soul as a given reality, a well-known and well-accredited person, without giving account of how one arrived at this conception, and what justification one has for using it scientifically. But primum vivere, deinde philosophari, down with Kant, vivat our Leibniz. To return, then, to Leibniz. I cannot ascribe to the Théodicée, as a methodical and broad unfolding of optimism, any other merit than this, that it gave occasion later for the immortal Candide of the great Voltaire, whereby certainly Leibniz's often repeated and lame excuse for the evil of the world, that the bad sometimes brings about the good, received a confirmation which was unexpected by him. Even by the name of his hero, Voltaire indicates that it only requires sincerity to recognize the opposite of optimism. Really, upon this scene of sin, suffering, and death, optimism makes such an extraordinary figure that one would be forced to regard it as irony if one had not a sufficient explanation of its origin, in the secret source of it, insincere flattery, with insulting confidence in its success, which, as was mentioned above, is so delightfully disclosed by Hume. But indeed, to the palpably sophistical proofs of Leibniz that this is the best of all possible worlds, we may seriously and honestly oppose the proof that it is the worst of all possible worlds. For possible means not what one may construct in imagination, but what can actually exist and continue. Now this world is so arranged as to be able to maintain itself with great difficulty, but if it were a little worse, it could no longer maintain itself. Consequently, a worse world, since it could not continue to exist, is absolutely impossible. Thus this world itself is the worst of all possible worlds. For not only if the planets were to run their heads together, but even if any one of the actually appearing perturbations of their course, instead of being gradually balanced by others, continued to increase, the world would soon reach its end. Astronomers know upon what accidental circumstances, principally the irrational relation to each other of the periods of revolution, this depends, and have carefully calculated that it will always go on well; consequently the world also can continue and go on. We will hope that, although Newton was of an opposite opinion, they have not miscalculated, and consequently that the mechanical perpetual motion realized in such a planetary system will not also, like the rest, ultimately come to a standstill. Again, under the firm crust of the planet dwell the powerful forces of nature, which, as soon as some accident affords them free play, must necessarily destroy that crust with everything living upon it, as has already taken place at least 3 times upon our planet, and will probably take place oftener still. The earthquake of Lisbon, the earthquake of Haiti, the destruction of Pompeii, are only small playful hints of what is possible. A small alteration of the atmosphere, which cannot even be chemically proved, causes cholera, yellow fever, black death, etc., which carry off millions of men. A somewhat greater alteration would extinguish all life. A very moderate increase of heat would dry up all the rivers and springs. The brutes have received just barely so much in the way of organs and powers as enables them to procure with the greatest exertion sustenance for their own lives, and food for their offspring. Therefore, if a brute loses a limb, or even the full use of one, it must generally perish. Even of the human race, powerful as are the weapons it possesses in understanding and reason, 9/10 live in constant conflict with want, always balancing themselves with difficulty and effort upon the brink of destruction. Thus throughout, as for the continuance of the whole, so also for that of each individual being, the conditions are barely and scantily given, but nothing over. The individual life is a ceaseless battle for existence itself, while at every step destruction threatens it. Just because this threat is so often fulfilled, provision had to be made, by means of the enormous excess of the germs, that the destruction of the individuals should not involve that of the species, for which alone nature really cares. The world is therefore as bad as it possibly can be, if it is to continue to be at all. QED. The fossils of the entirely different kinds of animal species which formerly inhabited the planet afford us as a proof of our calculation the records of worlds the continuance of which was no longer possible, and which consequently were somewhat worse than the worst of possible worlds. Optimism is at bottom the unmerited self‐praise of the real originator of the world, the will to live, which views itself complacently in its works. And accordingly it is not only a false but also a pernicious doctrine, for it presents life to us as a desirable condition, and the happiness of man as the end of it. Starting from this, every one then believes that he has the most just claim to happiness and pleasure, and if, as is wont to happen, these do not fall to his lot, then he believes that he is wronged, nay, that he loses the end of his existence, while it is far more correct to regard work, privation, misery, and suffering crowned by death as the end of our life, as Brahmanism and Buddhism, and also genuine Christianity do. For it is these which lead to the denial of the will to live. In the New Testament the world is represented as a valley of tears, life as a process of purifying or refining, and the symbol of Christianity is an instrument of torture. Therefore, when Leibniz, Shaftesbury, Bolingbroke, and Pope brought forward optimism, the general offence which it gave depended principally upon the fact that optimism is irreconcilable with Christianity. As Voltaire states and explains in the preface to his excellent poem, Le Désastre de Liban, which is also expressly directed against optimism. This great man, whom I so gladly praise, in opposition to the abuse of venal German ink‐slingers, is placed decidedly higher than Rousseau by the insight to which he attained in 3 respects, and which prove the greater depth of his thinking. 1. The recognition of the preponderating magnitude of the evil and misery of existence with which he is deeply penetrated. 2. That of the strict necessity of the acts of will. 3. That of the truth of Locke's principle, that what thinks may also be material; while Rousseau opposes all this with declamations in his Profession de foi du Vicaire Savoyard, a superficial Protestant pastor's philosophy. as he also, in the same spirit, attacks the beautiful poem of Voltaire, which has just been referred to, with ill‐founded, shallow, and logically false reasoning, in the interests of optimism, in his long letter to Voltaire of 18th August 1756, which is devoted simply to this purpose. Indeed, the fundamental characteristic, and the proston pseudos of Rousseau's whole philosophy is this, that in the place of the Christian doctrine of original sin and the original depravity of the human race, he puts an original goodness and unlimited perfectibility of it, which has only been led astray by civilization and its consequences, and then founds upon this his optimism and humanism. As in Candide, Voltaire wages war in his facetious manner against optimism, Byron has also done so in his serious and tragic style, in his immortal masterpiece Cain, on account of which he also has been honoured with the invectives of the obscurantist Friedrich Schlegel. If now, in conclusion, to confirm my view, I were to give what has been said by great men of all ages in this anti‐optimistic spirit, there would be no end to the quotations, for almost every one of them has expressed in strong language his knowledge of the misery of this world. Thus, not to confirm, but merely to embellish this chapter, a few quotations of this kind may be given at the end of it. First of all, let me mention here that the Greeks, far as they were from the Christian and lofty Asiatic conception of the world, and although they decidedly stood at the point of view of the assertion of the will, were yet deeply affected by the wretchedness of existence. This is shown even by the invention of tragedy, which belongs to them. Another proof of it is afforded us by the custom of the Thracians, which is first mentioned by Herodotus, though often referred to afterwards, the custom of welcoming the new‐born child with lamentations, and recounting all the evils which now lie before it, and, on the other hand, burying the dead with mirth and jesting, because they are no longer exposed to so many and great sufferings. In a beautiful poem preserved for us by Plutarch, De Audiend Poet in Fine, this runs thus: ton funta thrinein, eis os erchetai kaka ton dau thananta kai panon pepaumenon kairantas euphimuntas ekpemtein domon. That is, lugere gentium tanta qui intrarit mala, at morte si quis finiisset miserias, hunc laude amicos atque laetitia exsequi. It is not to be attributed to historical relationship, but to the moral identity of the matter, that the Mexicans welcome the newborn child with the words, "My child, thou art born to endure, therefore endure, suffer, and keep silence." And, following the same feeling, Swift, as Walter Scott relates in his Life of Swift, early adopted the custom of keeping his birthday not as a time of joy but of sadness, and of reading on that day the passage of the Bible in which Job laments and curses the day on which it was said in the house of his father a man-child is born. Well known, and too long for quotation, is the passage in the Apology of Socrates, in which Plato makes this wisest of mortals say that death, even if it deprives us of consciousness forever, would be a wonderful gain, for a deep, dreamless sleep every day is to be preferred even to the happiest life. A saying of Heraclitus runs, to un bio anima men bios ergon de thanatos, that is, vitae nomen quidem est vita, opus autem mors, etymologicum magnum voce bios. Also, Eustathius ad Iliad 131. The beautiful lines of the Theogony are famous. Archein men mi psunai apikthani oisin aristan mid esidein augas oxeas ieliu funta topos okista pulas aidao perisai kai kestai polin gin epamisamenon. That is, optima sors homini natum non esse, nec unquam adspexisse diem flammiferumque iubar, altera iam genitum demiti protinus orco, et pressum multa mergere corpus humo. Sophocles, in Oedipus Colonus, 1225, has the following abbreviation of the same: Μιφούναι τον απάντα νίκα λόγον, το δέπε φάνη πινακέθεν όθεν περ οίκαι πολλού deuteron os taxista. That is, natum non esse sortes vincit alias omnes, proxima autem est, ubi quis in lucem editus fuerit, eodem redire unde venit quam ocissime. Euripides says, pas dodumiras bias anthropon, huc esti panon anapausis. That is, omnis hominum vita est plena dolore, nec datur laborum remissio. And Homer already said, Umen gar ti estin oidzu roteran andras panton ossa de Gaian epi penei tekai erpe. That is, non enim quidquam alicubi est calimitosius homine omnium quot super terram spirantque et voventur. 2:17, 446. Even Pliny says, qua propter hoc primum, quisque in remediis animi sui habeat ex omnibus bonis, quae homini natura tribuit, nullum melius esse tempestiva morte. Natural History, 28:2. Shakespeare puts the words in the mouth of the old King Henry IV. O heaven, that one might read the book of fate, and see the revolution of the times, how chances mock, and changes fill the cup of alteration with diverse liquors. Oh, if this were seen, the happiest youth, viewing his progress through, what perils past, what crosses to ensue, would shut the book, and sit him down, and die. Finally, Byron: count o'er the joys thine hours have seen, count o'er thy days from anguish free, and know whatever thou hast been, 'tis something better not to be. Balthazar Gracian also brings the misery of our existence before our eyes in the darkest colours in the Criticon, parte 1, Crisi 5, just at the beginning, and Crisi 7 at the end, where he explicitly represents life as a tragic farce. Yet no one has so thoroughly and exhaustively handled this subject as in our own day Leopardi. He is entirely filled and penetrated by it. His theme is everywhere the mockery and wretchedness of this existence. He presents it upon every page of his works, yet in such a multiplicity of forms and applications, with such wealth of imagery, that he never wearies us, but on the contrary is throughout entertaining and exciting. End of chapter 46. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine.